Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya Janmadyasya Yato Anvayaditaratascha Artheshu Abhigyaswarat Tene Brahmahridaya Adikavaye Muhyanti Yatsurayah Tejo Vari Mridam Yatha Vinimayo Yatra Trisargo Mrisha Dhamna Svena Sada Nirastakohakam Satyam Param Dhimahi Nigamakalpataror Galitam Phalam Shukamukad Amritadrava Sanyutam Pibata Bhagavatam Rasamalayam Muhuraho Rasikha Bhuvi Bhavukaha. So now we enter the 6th chapter of the 7th Skandha of Srimad Bhagavatam. We are in the middle of the glorious story of Prahlada and his demoniac father Hiranyakashipu. So we saw in the last chapter how Prahlad grows up to be such a wonderful saintly being, and despite his teachers Shanda and Amarka trying to teach him worldly knowledge, he only wants to speak of the glories of the Supreme Being, and therefore Hiranyakashipu tried to kill him in many ways. He couldn't. Finally, his teachers said, "Don't worry, we will corrupt his mind somehow because his body seems invincible." And so they tried to take him to the school and teach him, but he is not receptive to anything. And then one day, when the teachers leave, the other boys there in the school, who are all normally interested in worldly knowledge, they sit around Prahlada asking him to teach them something because they know how great a child he is. So Prahlada starts teaching them. He speaks every single word in this sequence of teachings he gives. Each verse is worth contemplating for a long time, just as the previous chapter. Every sentence Prahlad speaks is literally quotable as the divine revelation. So let's begin. Prahlad says right away, in this human life, one ought to practice virtues conducive to God realization from childhood, because human life is so rare and yet it is also transient. So right away he begins by teaching these boys that don't think that you can wait till you are old and then think about God. This is how the society normally conditions people, that you can first enjoy life and do whatever you have to do, and then finally, when you are old, you can turn to God. The problem with that is one lives a life of misery, because what is called enjoyment is nothing but chasing after various greedy goals, causing envy, comparison, and therefore misery, competition, jealousy, all of that. So one lives a life of misery, completely tired, all his life energy sapped, and then when he has no energy left, unable to understand the finer points of the highest teachings of self-knowledge, of God realization, to listen to it becomes not effective at all. So Prahlad right away says, Kaumara acharet pragyo dharman bhagavataniha. As a child, engage in Bhagavan's knowledge, Bhagavatan. Because he says, Durlabam manusham janma tadapi adhruvam arthadam. Because this manusha janma, this life of a human is so rare. So do not waste this, don't fritter it away in frivolous pursuits, but engage in God realization right away. So one, therefore, if one has children, the highest and the most beneficial knowledge one can give them is not take them to 100 different classes and teach them various skills. Some skills are okay, anything is fine, as long as it's not rooted in God realization. They only result in a waste of time eventually. Therefore, giving wisdom and devotion to God is the highest blessing and boon one can teach a child. That's what Prahlad says in the first verse. Then he says, therefore, the only course advisable for a man in this world is to surrender to the feet of the Supreme Lord Vishnu, because he is the friend of all beings, and not only that, he is the very self of all beings. He says, Yatahi Purushasya iha Vishnoho Padopasarpanam Yadesha Sarvabhutanam Priya Atmeshwara Suhrit. Every word, as we said, is so beautiful. The Sanskrit is so beautiful too for those who can understand it. And the meaning is so sublime. He says, therefore, the very purpose of one's life is to surrender to the Supreme Lord, Vishnoho Padapa Sarpanam. Because if one surrenders to the Supreme Lord with clear understanding that Vishnu, the Supreme Being, is the dear to all beings, he says, first, Sarvabhutanam Priya. He is dear to all beings, but not only that, he says, Atma. He is their very self, Ishvaraha. He is the inner controller. And Suhrit, he is their well-wisher. So when we recognize God as this, not as some entity sitting in the sky alone, judging others and so on, but as present in every single being, that surrender is what Prahlada recommends. Not the kind of surrender that makes one hate others or makes one divide others into believers and non-believers and all the rest, but surrender to the Supreme Lord, seeing Him as the heart of all beings, well-wisher of all beings, inner controller of all beings, and therefore recognizing that people who are also not taking to this or doing this out of his own Maya, and therefore looking at them with compassion rather than any kind of judgment. And with this attitude to surrender to the Supreme Lord is what Prahlad says, Vishnoho Padopasarpanam. Then he says, because any other activity comes on its own, therefore one should not make too much effort for it. He says, all the sensual pleasures, whatever one is meant to get will come. So Prahlad here says that people make so much effort to get various sensual pleasures, but he says they come on their own, whatever is meant to come. So if one has an attitude of contentment, then whatever sensual pleasures will come. So we can see even among surrendered devotees that some are very rich, some are very poor, some are in between, because everybody has their own destiny by which they acquire wealth. But the inner attitude is the same, that they do not have any sense of ownership, proprietorship, or enjoyership. It is recognized that the owner, proprietor, and enjoyer is only the Supreme Lord. So Yudhishthira, the great king, who is the proprietor of the largest kingdom, Bhishma, the great warrior, or Sudama, who was a very poor Brahmin, they all, though their material levels were so different, inner state was exactly the same. They saw Krishna or Bhagavan Narayana as the only proprietor. So Prahlad says, recognize that sensual pleasure will then come in its own way. Yudhishthira was meant to be a king, Sudama was meant to be poor, and yet they both had no complaints about it. When Yudhishthira became poor because of being banished to the forest, he had the same attitude. When Sudama became rich because of being blessed by visiting Dwaraka, he had the same attitude. Nothing changed inwardly for them. So Prahlad says, sensual pleasure, it is exactly the same as suffering too, he says. Suffering comes even if one doesn't make any effort. Similarly, pleasure comes even if one doesn't make any effort, what is destined to come. Therefore, don't make effort. He says, no effort for such pleasure should be made. Instead, one should only focus on attaining the lotus feet of the Lord. Otherwise, if one is making effort for all these worldly pleasures, such efforts will waste away one's life and one will not attain the lotus feet of the Supreme Lord Mukunda. He says, Tat prayaso na kartavyo yata ayur vyayah param na tatha vindate kshemam mukunda charanambujam. Again, every word is so powerful. He says, not to be done, na kartavyo tat prayaso. This effort ought not to be done, by which life energy is wasted. Yata ayur vyayaha. Because not only is life energy wasted, he says, na tatha vindate kshemam mukunda charanambujam. Because then one cannot attain the lotus feet of Mukunda, the bestower of liberation, the Supreme Lord, by wasting one's life energies. Therefore, he says, having fallen into fear, because the very nature of embodied life is fear, because there is always death, there is old age, there is sickness. So as long as one is considering oneself to be the body, there is fear around the corner. So having fallen into the embodied life of fear, if one ought to get out of fear, if one needs to attain fearlessness, blessedness, then one should strive for it even while the body is sound, healthy, and therefore engage it when all the aspects of the body, mind, intellect are all robust. He says, Tato yateta kushalakshemaya bhayamashritah shariram paurusham yavan na vipadyeta pushkalam. So he says, when you are healthy, when you are robust, that's when you have to engage for this state of fearlessness. Because the state of fearlessness is not to be easily attained by one who is already caught in fear in old age, when his faculties are weak and death is waiting. It's very difficult for such a person with lifelong attachment to fear and to the bodily conception to suddenly step out of it. So the sooner one gets out of it young, that's why Prahlada is advising these boys, you ought to not think this is for old people, this is for everyone. At whatever age one gets into this, one has to do it. Because then Prahlad gives a beautiful math here. He says, normally, human's lifetime is considered 100 years. He says, Pumso Varsha Shatam Ayu. 100 years is considered the normal lifespan. So this was the lifespan considered in Vedic conception as the correct lifespan of a human being. Of course, most people don't get to live till 100, and because of various unhealthy habits and so on, or because of one's own destiny, whatever it might be, people may die younger than that. But 100 years is considered the full life. Even all the astrological charts are based on the calculation of 100 years. So Prahlad says, let's say 100 years is reckoned to be the length of a man's life. He says half of this is lost in simply sleep and other activities because of one who is not controlled. He says, Ardham ajitatmanaha. Ajitatmanaha means one who has not controlled himself, one who has not regulated himself. Half of this is simply going away in sleep and other activities, because one sleeps, let's say, for 8 hours a day. If one is not very regulated, he may even sleep 8-9 hours instead of being able to reduce the amount of sleep to 6 or 7 hours. The sleep quantum increases. Then not only that, one engages in all kinds of activities to do things such as cleaning oneself and food and so on. Taking something as simple as food, if one is regulating his palate, then one can have a simple meal, prepare a simple meal with 1 or 2 dishes, sometimes not even need any preparation, just have milk and fruits and nuts and so on, which are healthy, needing no preparation, or make a very simple preparation of 1 or 2 dishes and eat, then it's very quick. But if one normally, as he says, ajita atmanaha, one who is not controlled, he says, I have to eat this cuisine today, that cuisine today. He drives to restaurants, looking for various meals, sitting there. So hours get wasted. So he says half the life, so 12 hours a day, which is probably less than what most people even today spend. Prahlad is saying half the life, probably people spend more than half the life in these activities between sleep of 8 hours or 9 hours sometimes for many people, and all these various activities of eating out or cooking elaborate meals, and then being also lethargic because of eating too much. Between all of this, one loses 12 hours a day easily, and therefore 50 years is gone. Prahlad says half the life is gone. Then the remaining time, out of that, 20 of that pass in infancy and boyhood, because one is either caught in play or in infantile place, that is, or in adolescent attractions and so on. Then when he becomes old, he becomes also senile. So the last part of his life, let's say the last 20 years, he is senile. So what Prahlad basically says is, even if 100 years life is there, 50 years is gone, which is very true. We don't realize it, but most people who live a normal life of sense gratification, who are not controlled, who are engaged in all these various ways of eating out and making elaborate food and sleeping, 50 years of their life is gone simply in eating and sleeping. Then he says 20 years is gone when one is infant or a adolescent engaged in playing or in other attractions. The last 20 years is in senility. So what is there is in between. And there also what Prahlad doesn't talk about, which was not the case at that time, but now that is people waste a lot of time consuming then entertainment, watching news, looking at the phone. So if we count all those in terms of years, then unfortunately in today's world, out of 100 years, probably 90 years are gone in frivolous activities. And even 100 years, of course, is not the lifespan of almost anyone. So what Prahlad says here is almost practically the whole life is wasted like this by people. Now, one important point to note here, very interestingly, is these verses of Prahlad are so powerful and they exactly mirror the great work of Bhagavatpada Adi Shankara called Bhajagovindam. So, Bhajagovindam, which is a very famous work, there also Shankaracharya gives very direct instructions chastising people for this kind of activities. In fact, there is a verse that parallels exactly what Prahlad says, where Bhagavatpada Shankara says, Balastavat Krida Saktaha, Tarunastavat Taruni Saktaha, Vriddhastavat Chinta Magnaha, Parame Brahmani Kopina Lagnaha. He says, the young boys, they are attached to play, Krida Saktaha. Then the youth, Tarunastava Taruni Saktaha, the youth are attracted to women or the other way around. So they are wasting their time in attachment to the opposite sex. Then Vriddhastava Chinta Magnaha, old age people are always caught in worry. They are either worried about their health or worried about other people who are aged and deceased or worried about their children. They are just caught in worry. So Shankara says, Parame Brahmani Kopina Lagnaha. Therefore, nobody is spending time inquiring into the supreme reality, the supreme truth, Parabrahman. This is exactly what Prahlad also says. In fact, this whole chapter where Prahlad is giving direct instructions on how not to waste life is a very close parallel to Bhajagovindam, which also has the same set of instructions. And this is no wonder because, as we saw in the sixth Skandha, there are 12 Mahajans listed, and one of them is Prahlad, and the other of them is Shiva himself, who came in the form of Shankaracharya. So Adi Shankara Bhagavad Pada is Shiva himself, who is a great Mahajan, and so is Prahlad, who is another great Mahajan, and therefore their instructions are exactly the same. In fact, one almost thinks Adi Shankara wrote these works looking at Prahlad's teachings in Bhagavatam, though it's possible that Adi Shankara completely wrote them independently and they just happen to be the same instructions. Because just as Prahlad says here, Shankara also says people waste their lives in these frivolous pursuits. Anyway, so now we continue with Prahlad and we will bring more parallels with Bhajagovindam. Prahlad now says, therefore, out of 100 years, we see how majority of life is wasted in frivolous pursuits, play, old age, senility, and so on. So he says, then what happens is the man gets so attached, he gets so bound to the house, bound to cords of affection. Then how can he leave this? He has this thirst for wealth. And when this thirst for wealth takes him over, then he behaves just as a thief does or as a merchant does. He is even ready to give up his beloved life in pursuit of wealth. Now, this is again no exaggeration because we see how people work so hard sometimes to acquire money, and in the process, they kill their own health, they eat unhealthy, they don't have healthy habits, they sit in the same place, and then they take to bad habits to relieve their stress, including overeating or substance abuse, and they literally kill themselves. Sometimes they also drive because of this distracted. So many ways in which people, because of their desire for wealth accumulation, either instantly through accidents and so on, or gradually through bad habits, kill themselves. So Prahlad says people are ready to even give up their life because thirst for wealth is so dangerous that, like a thief or a servant or a merchant, they are ready to even give up their life in order to acquire some wealth. Again, if we look at Bhajagovindam, Shankara says there, the second verse, in fact, he says, Muda jahihi dhanagama trishnam. He says, oh fool, Mudha. Shankara also uses very strong language. And the same word Mudha is used by Prahlad here also, we will see later. Adi Shankara says, Mudha, O fool, give up this thirst for wealth. Jahihi dhanagama trishnam. Kurusat buddhim manasi vitrishnam. Devote your mind to the thoughts of the Supreme. And then he says, Yallabhase nija karmopatam. Be content with what comes. Vittam tena vinodaya chittam. Because whatever comes through one's own karma. So we already saw this, by the way, referred to by Prahlad, where he said, don't chase after wealth, don't chase after sense pleasures. Whatever one is meant to get will come on its own. Focus your energy on the Supreme Being. Exactly what Shankara says too in this verse. Give up this thirst for amassment of wealth. Be content with what comes and focus only on inquiring and devoting to the Supreme Self, Supreme Spirit. So Prahlad also says the same thing. He says, if you have this thirst for wealth, you will end up giving up your own life, because what will happen is your mind will be attached to relatives, attached to children, attached to the sweet counsel of your sympathetic wife. Then how will you ever be free of it? He says very beautifully, these verses are so evocative and so true. Today it's also called as pillow talk. For example, when one is being sweetly and secretly whispered in the ears by his beloved, it's looks so important that one is able to completely get deluded by it and not look for what is the ultimate good, but get carried away by it. So here Prahlada says, Katam priyaya anukampitayaha sangam rahasyam ruchi mantran. He says mantra. He says it is like mantra she is saying in the ears, or the other way around too. He is saying in her ears, depending on who it is. He says these rahasyam mantran. So these secretive words that are being whispered into the ears through very close association, which is exactly what is called as pillow talk, is so tempting for the fellow that he or she gets deceived by it, forgetting what is the ultimate good, and gets so attached to it. So, therefore, he says, then he remembers only his sons, his daughters, his brothers and sisters, his old parents, his house, his abundant furniture, vacations, animals. How can he then renounce any of them? He beautifully lists everything: Bhratran, Pitarau, Dinau, Grihan, Vritti, everything, all this. And this is all literally true of people seen today, being attached to furniture, attached to houses, attached to their collections of paintings, attached to people around, attached to old aged parents, attached to young children. Prahlad says, when you are attached to all of this, then where is the hope for you to get free of attachment? He says. And then what you do is, he's saying you're pursuing actions out of greed. And then, like a silkworm, he says, a silkworm builds a nest and then it imprisons itself within that nest. And Prahlad beautifully gives the simile to say that's exactly what people do. They pursue actions out of greed and then they get imprisoned by that very action. So, how people, they even call it the golden chain. They tie a golden chain around themselves, they get into a job, and they say, I cannot quit this job, because they think they are somehow indispensable, or they are not able to get out of their commitments. It is one thing to be responsible and to take care of what is necessary for one's family members, whether it's parents or whether it's children, but it is quite another thing to be attached to them in an unhealthy way. Taking care of old parents is a very noble thing, but being so attached to them that it becomes a bondage is not a good thing for either them or the old parents, because the old parents are supposed to spend their last years also remembering and dwelling in the eternal, rather than being comforted by their children and getting more bound by attachment. So, to encourage old parents to live independently while giving them the necessary support so that they can live alone is the right way and helpful to them rather than keeping them bound by attachment. Similarly, with young children as well, similarly, with wealth and everything, things. That's why there is the beautiful system of Varnashrama, where it is said one is in Brahmacharya as a student, then Grahastha as a householder, and at some point when children are grown up, one goes to Vanaprastha, which means one leaves the household setup, goes alone, and spends his time teaching others, helping others, and getting freed of attachment so that one is prepared to enter sannyasa, which is total renunciation. So Prahlad says here, if you are caught up in all these attachments, starting with even things like furniture and animals and servants, and then all the houses and people, how can you ever hope to get out of it? What you do is you end up building a prison for yourself. And that's exactly what people do today. And Prahlad says beautifully, you think highly of the pleasures of sex, of palate, and then you never get disgusted with it. In the last chapter, he again said beautifully, it was a very powerful verse again in the last chapter. He said, Punav punav acharva charvanam. Punav punav charvita charvanam. That means those who chew the thing that they have already chewed and they take pleasure out of it. Punav punav charvita charvananam. So, this is exactly what people do. You've already tasted the pleasure, you keep tasting it again and again and again, and it never gets tiring. He says they never get disgusted with it. They are constantly going over the same thing. And then Prahlad says, fond of his family, the careless fellow does not even perceive his life withering away in his endeavor to maintain his family, and his real purpose of God realization does not even occur to him. So his mind is always afflicted by agony and he is always caught in it. This is exactly again what Bhagavad Pada Shankaracharya says. He says in many verses in Bhajagovindam that you are thinking of this attachment all the time, and thereby you are not able to spend anything, any amount of your energy in the ultimate pursuit. He says, Vayasi gate kaha kama vikaraha शुष्के नीरे कह का सारः क्षीणो वित्ते कह परिवारः ज्ञाते तत्वे कह संसारः. He says, what good is lust when youth has fled? What good is a lake when water is gone? What good are relatives when wealth is gone? See, this is the other important thing. In another verse in Bhaja Govindam, Shankaracharya also says, Putratapi dhana bhajam bhitihi. He says, one who is wealthy is even afraid of his own child, because this is exactly seen today as well. When the man is wealthy and he is old, the children are only interested in getting the will written so that they can get the property. They fight among them, they manipulate him, and in very extreme cases, they even cause harm to him. So, Shankara very presciently wrote then that the wealthy man is afraid of his own children. This is the state of the affairs. Therefore, that's why Shankara says in Bhajagovindam, there's another verse where he says that whatever possession you have, everything will go away. He says, Ma kuru dhanajana yavvana garvam harati nimeshat kala sarvam. He says, whatever you have, wealth and relatives and youth and strength, everything will be taken away by time in one instant. Therefore, recognize this fact, get rid of delusion, and surrender unto the Supreme Lord. And that's exactly, again, mirroring what Prahlad is chastising here, the worldly ways of people. He says, you are building a prison of your own relatives, your own family ties, your own house, furniture, attachments, possessions, all the rest. You are caught in the pleasures of sex or palate or attachments to people or house and all the rest. And then you are so careless, then how can you ever hope to get out of this and focus on God realization? And then therefore he says, not only that, people then start misappropriating others' wealth. So one who is always intent on accumulating riches never stops at legitimate ways. He goes about taking others' wealth as well. So there is a beautiful Upanishadic statement in Ishavasya Upanishad where it says, Ishavasyam idam sarvam yatkinchit jagatyam jagat tena tyaktena bhunjitaha magrida kasyasvidhanam. It says, everything here is pervaded by the Lord and belongs to Him. Therefore, do not covet anyone else's wealth. And yet, that's exactly what people do when we engage in activities which are meant to maximize our profits in some way or the other, and also work for companies which are engaging in all kinds of evil ways to maximize profit. We are only engaging in such actions. Then Prahlad says, therefore, one is caught in the differential outlook of I and mine and others, and with this delusion, he can only go to hell. He becomes a complete ignorant fool. So the word mudha, again, as we said, is exactly what Prahlad also used here. Yata vimudha. He says, as a completely ignorant fool, he doesn't know what is good for him. And therefore, he says he is lost to his own purpose and caught in the prison of his own making. Then he says he becomes also a toy deer for lustful women, or it can be men too. Again, he says, Kamadrisham vihara krida mrigo yen nigado visargaha. Very powerful line. Prahlad says, then when he is attracted to sex, he becomes like a animal, just as a toy deer is being moved around and played with. He becomes a plaything, or she becomes a plaything, and then the people who are attached to lust, they end up using him or her, and he is lost to his very purpose. And therefore he says finally, o boys, recognize all these perils by being caught in worldly ways. Therefore set your mind only on the Supreme Lord Narayana, the original deity, for he is the one who is the only purpose of all our existence. Beautifully he says, therefore, Upeta Narayanam Adidevam sa Mukta Sangair Ishito Apavargah. Narayana Adideva, the Supreme Lord, he is the only well-wisher. As we already saw Prahlad say, he is in the heart of all beings. Recognize him. Then he now moves to the positive side, having chastised the ways of the world, the ways of people caught in worldly attachment. Now Prahlad says, instead, now having mentioned surrender to Narayana, he says, if one does this, then there is no effort involved. He says beautifully, there is no exertion involved in one engaging in devoting to the surrendering to the Supreme Lord, because he is the self of all beings who is present everywhere. He says, Nahi achyutam prinayato bahava ayaso asuratmajaha Atmatvat sarvabhutanam siddhatvadiha sarvatah. He says, Bhagavan is not something to be found looking upward or looking into a temple necessarily or looking anywhere else. He is literally everywhere, sarvatah. So, one who gets this wisdom, there is no effort involved. There is no such thing as one has to attain a state of enlightenment or one has to have some fireworks go, some great samadhi. Prahlad gives the direct way of complete effortless recognition that the Supreme Being is everywhere. Then who is there to make effort? What effort is to be made? There is only the recognition and complete surrender to Achyuta, the infallible Lord Narayana. So he says there is no exertion. Many people ask this question about how can there be no effort. That's exactly the secret that Prahlad gives here. It doesn't mean one is idle. One can, in fact, one is then drawn to reading such great works, singing the glories of Bhagavan, talking about it, writing about it. All of this happens from the mood of love and not effort, because there is nothing to attain. He already is here and now as the very source of existence itself. So Prahlad says he is the self and the activities also. Then he explains it further. He says every being from a smallest ant, or further than an ant, he says even from a vegetable all the way to Brahma, the creator, all the five elements, all the gunas, everything is only pervaded by the one Supreme Lord who is the self of all, the Almighty, imperishable Bhagavan. Beautiful verse again. He says, everything, Paravareshu, Bhuteshu, Brahmanta Stavaradishu, Bhautikeshu, Mahatsu, Guneshu. So all this, in all the gunas, in all the elements, and all the creatures, starting from Brahma to the smallest vegetable or even smaller than that. He says in everything what is there, Ekayeva Parohi Atma Bhagavan Ishvaro Avyayah. He says the Supreme Lord, imperishable, Bhagavan, the self of all, he alone abides in that. And then he says, how can we perceive him? He is, of course, imperceivable, he is indescribable, and yet he is hinted as the subject and object of the whole universe. Again, a beautiful verse of Prahlada. He says, Pratyag Atma Swarupena Drishya Rupena Cha Swayam Vyapaka Nirdeshyo Vyapya Vyapaka Nirdeshyo He Anirdeshyo Avikalpitaha. He says he is Anirdeshya, he is indescribable, and yet he is seen as the Vyapya Vyapaka, that is the one who pervades the universe, and that he pervades, that the substance which he pervades is also made of him, and the underlying pervading force is also him. He says, therefore, the subject is him, the object is him. The objective universe is him, and the subject, which is pure consciousness that pervades the universe, is him. Vyapya Vyapaka Nirdeshya. Very beautiful expression again. It's very hard to even translate. That is, that which pervades and that which it is pervading is both him. And therefore, when we look at our own being, all the thoughts, all the emotions, all the activities of the senses of the body, these are all the things which are called as that which is being pervaded. And that which pervades that is pure consciousness, which is Bhagavan. So he says both. Therefore, the realm of activities and the silence of being are both him. So who is there to then be separate? There is only him. And what is his nature? Prahlad says, Kevala Anubhava Ananda Swarupaha Parameshwara. He says he is pure bliss. Kevala Anubhava Ananda. Pure bliss, Parameshwara, the supreme being. Therefore, he says, summarizing all this, he beautifully says, Tasmat Sarveshu Bhuteshu Dayam Kurata Sauhridam Asuram Bhavam Anmuchya Yaya Tushyati Adhokshajaha. He says, therefore, have compassion and love towards all beings. See, this is the beautiful conclusion of Prahlad. This is the difference of devotion of Prahlad, devotion of Bhagavatam, the surrender of Bhagavatam from other ways, because this surrender leads one to love all beings. He says again, he is present in all the beings. He has given the description. He says he is the subject and the object. He is everything we see, everyone we see. And therefore, when we recognize this, we can only please him. He says, Tushyati Adhokshajam. He is pleased only when we have love and compassion towards all beings of the universe. So he says, do that. And then he says, what else is worth worrying about? What is the use of worrying about religious merit? What is the use of worrying about pleasures? What is the use of worrying about wealth, dharma, artha, kama? And then beautifully Prahlad says, what is the use of even worrying about moksha? He says, even moksha, which is considered the highest goal among the four, is also only as long as one takes oneself to be separate. So Bhagavatam is beyond moksha dharma, it is Bhagavata dharma. And here Prahlad captures it very beautifully. He says, forget religious merit, forget pleasures, forget wealth, forget moksha too, because all there is only the Supreme Lord. He is the subject, he is the object. Surrender unto him, adore him, as we already saw in the last chapter. Listen about his glories, sing his glories, remember him. Shravana, Kirtana, Smarana, Vandana, Pada Sevana, Dasyare, Pujana, Sakhijana, Atma Nivedana. He says, therefore, listen about him, sing about him, adore his lotus feet, remember him, make friends with him, and serve him, fall prostrate to him, serve his devotees, love all beings, and surrender your heart and soul to him. This is all one needs to do, and not look for moksha, not look for liberation. That's what Prahlad is teaching here. And therefore he says beautifully, what is the use of hankering after anything? All of this, he says finally, I consider nothing to be worth anything unless it is leading us to the Supreme Lord Narayana. And then he concludes by saying, all of this for me, because now the boys are wondering, how come Prahlad knows all this? So Prahlad says, all of this I learned from the great Narada, who learned it from from Narayana himself. He says, Narayano narasakaha kila Naradaya ekantinam bhagavatas akinchananam padaravinda raja sa pluta dehinam syat. He says, by getting this wisdom from Narada, so he says it is not possible, first of all, to attain this wisdom in any way other than serving the lotus feet of the great devotees. Padara Vinda Raja, he says the dust of the lotus feet of the devotees. Which kind of devotees? He says Bhagavataha Akinchananam, that is those who do not consider anything to be their own. Ekantinanam, that is, he says, those who are singularly devoted to him, who do not consider anything to be their own, who consider everything to be the Supreme Lord Narayana, they alone can give this wisdom. And Narada, therefore, is such a great devotee. As we saw, he is also one of the 12 Mahajans. So Prahlad says, Narada, he gave me this wisdom and he learned it from Narayana himself. He says, Shrutam etat maya purvam jnanam vijnana sanyutam dharmam bhagavatam shuddham Narada devadarshanat. He says, Narada, who saw Devadarshana, means to see the Lord directly. Narada, who was blessed with the vision of the Lord directly, and we saw this great episode in the very first Skandha. So he says, Narada, who was blessed with the Lord directly and got this wisdom. There are a few rare beings. We have seen in Bhagavatam already how Narada was blessed, Brahma was blessed, Dhruva was blessed, so on. So Narada, who was blessed by Narayana himself, he says, this Narada, who got this wisdom from Narayana, he taught me this dharmam bhagavatam shuddham, this pure dharma of Bhagavatam, that is this pure liberating wisdom of total surrender unto the Supreme Lord. He says, this has been heard by me, learned by me from Narada. With this he concludes. Now, the demon boys, the boys in the school. So these boys in the school, they are called demon boys. In reality, they are just boys who are like any boys of current day schooling system, because all the boys of the current day schooling system, boys and girls, are in the same mindset. They are innocent. These boys are also innocent, these demon boys, and yet they are being polluted and corrupted by the conditioning of the society to become demons, which is exactly what's happening today. So these boys then ask Prahlada, "Oh Prahlada, we have been since infants in this school only. You've been with us in this school only. We know no other teachers. The only two teachers we have are the Shanda and Amarka. We already saw them." So they ask him, how come you are referring to Narada? Narada, we have heard of him as a great devotee, but nobody has seen Narada here. This is the world of Hiranyakashipu, and we have never seen him. And you've never seen him from what we know, because you've been with us all along. So how are you talking about having learned from Narada? What's the ground for this? So this question that about Narada that they are asking Prahlada will answer the mystery of this in the next chapter. With this chapter ends, this powerful chapter of first teaching the frivolousness of engaging in worldly ways, chastising the ways of people attached to worldly attachments, that is, and then glorifying the way of devotion, the way of surrender, which is effortless, and describing the nature of the Lord as the all-pervading being and the sweetness of surrender, which involves no effort. Prahlada has given such beautiful instructions in this chapter. Now we will see going forward how Prahlada learned it from Narada. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya.